Okay, hi, and welcome to our next guest lecture in conversation with Mark Ryan, who I'm really excited to have a chat with today about wicked problems and his perspectives. So we'll just start with Mark, if you could introduce yourself a bit to the students.
Yeah, so like you said, my name's Mark Ryan. I've got probably about a 22-year career now in various areas around media, marketing, digital, television production, learning and development, strategy. So a whole range of areas that I probably didn't necessarily think I'd move into when I was an undergraduate. But yeah, my role these days is heading up strategic communications at Queensland Rail. So we've got around 8,000 plus employees spread across the length and breadth of Queensland. So trying to make sure that we're keeping them up to date with what's happening throughout the organisation, what the strategic direction of the organisation is, what are some of the key initiatives that we've got going on. And it's a wonderful challenge too, because so many of those staff members, they're not sitting in front of a computer as a knowledge worker. They're still out on track gangs, and they're out as customer service staff at stations and other venues. So it's a wonderful challenge and a big iconic Queensland organisation as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that challenge.
Yeah, so that is a big jump from doing a Bachelor of Arts in, was it journalism and media?
Yeah, Bachelor of Arts in Journalism, and I was doing a double degree,
Yeah,
so a Bachelor of Laws as well at the
yeah,
start.
yeah. So it's a long journey. So maybe just start us off with, because we really want students to be thinking about their values and their own story and how that connects with what they're good at and their capabilities and maybe what they want to learn. So could you tell us a bit about your own, your own story and how you came to decide on that particular choice of degree? So yeah, a bit about your background and early influences.
Yeah, I've probably thought about this a fair bit. I mean, in general, I'm I guess, a pretty curious human being. I like finding out about different things. And if I sort of wind the clock back a long way, my family, so my brother and I, we grew up in public housing up in Redcliffe, and that was for Australia at the time back in the 80s, that was a really diverse kind of area to grow up in. You had long-term unemployed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living there, newly arrived migrants, people living with disabilities. It was really a bit of a cultural melting pot up that way. So I look at it that I probably grew up in a non-traditional Australian environment as well, because we did have so much diversity around us. And I think from a young age too, that lended itself to being quite curious about the perspectives of people and trying to understand more about the way they were living or how they got into different situations and that sort of thing. So when I was in high school, I was probably fortunate enough to have a lot of options based on the results that I got at school. And probably the two dreams that I'd had at that point were working in sports journalism or working in criminal law. So hence why I ended up going down that pathway of doing the BA with a major in journalism and also taking on the double degree doing law as well. And even going through journalism, I kind of went through these different waves of where I did want to end up. There was a period where I had a really fantastic tutor in feature writing, a lady named Chris Olsen, who's still around the Brisbane scene as well. And she knew I wanted to be a sports journalist, and she was constantly sort of saying, "Oh, you're missing a trick here. You show a lot more interest in people and their stories than the average person who wants to be in sport journalism. I think you should do feature writing." Being 20 at the time, I took no notice of what she said, and it wasn't really until I got into my probably early 30s that I realised that, in a sense, human development and human stories was more where I did want to work. And that was kind of after I'd been through this long pathway of working as a broadcast journalist in sport, and then moving into sports television production as well. So I guess that key part I come back to is I'm just genuinely curious about people. And I think that's how I ended up making my way into different areas like strategy and learning and development and leadership development as well, just from that interest in people and their backgrounds and their stories, and understanding in a way how you can weave someone's own background into, I guess, a situation to try to help them make meaning and make sense of what's going on, whether it be in an organization or other parts of society that we have.
Yeah. I think curiosity is probably a key attraction for people that come to Bachelor of Arts. Thinking about myself, curiosity comes up as my top strength. And I think, wanting to find out about history or to learn more about, society or media and communications, curiosity is probably a big driver. Is it something that you've had to hone as a strength or foster, or has it just been from your childhood and being exposed to such diversity there?
Wow, that's a good question. I always asked a lot of questions as a kid. And it's funny now, I've got 4 boys and they are constantly asking questions. And don't get me wrong, it's a pain in the backside sometimes, but most of the time I love the fact that they are asking so many questions about the world. So in a way, even if I wasn't necessarily fostering that curiosity, I've got 4 little humans who are, genuinely trying to be curious and naturally curious about the world around them. These days, in terms of my own curiosity, I really enjoy just reading and listening to podcasts. So for me, the happy space is driving to work and having a really intriguing podcast on, which it tends to be more in those areas around social sciences or anthropology or complexity, problem solving, just those kinds of quirky things. And it doesn't necessarily be hardcore in those areas. It's more just listening to people and the way they look at different patterns or look at complexity and try to navigate those spaces where there is no simple answer to anything. So in a way, I probably use that as my big driver of how I continue to be curious. I'm probably one of those, super nerds too, who quite likes reading literature when it comes to my own studies. So I'm most of the way through a Master of Business Administration with Griffith, and I know a lot of people do not like reading literature and other pieces of research and articles, but for me, that's one of the attractions of doing the study, is that you get exposed to so much amazing research which people have already done. So for me, I'm always trying to absorb that and then try to make sense of how I can use that thinking in my own job or in my own life as well.
Yeah, it's really really exciting. So there's a lot of different questions that I want to ask, because maybe tell us a bit about how your pathway from journalism into eventually in the health sector as a start, so that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I never would have guessed that I'd be working in the health sector 2 decades into my career. That was something that I think the health sector found me more than I found the health sector, to be perfectly honest. And it's probably if I was to take one lesson from it too, it's to not necessarily, when you're an undergraduate, to think that you know what your passion is when you're 18, 19, 20 years of age, or for someone starting an undergraduate later in life, it's actually to maybe just go with the flow a bit more and explore and see what you really enjoy, because the health sector for me is I think just a phenomenal sector to be working in. This was pre-COVID and during COVID as well. How I made the jump, I guess that's an interesting one. So most of my career was in journalism and communications and media. And I ended up, my wife was working at the Mater Hospital in Brisbane. And so just by sheer luck, I was dropping off our kids at the childcare centre at Mater. And I ran into an old workmate, and she was working at the foundation, which is the philanthropic arm of Mater. And she was just saying she was having this amazing time. It's the best group of people to work with. And fortuitously, a job came up there a couple of weeks later. So she put in a good word for me with the GM who was running that area. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, I've got a job working at Mater Foundation. And then as you do, I guess, for anyone who ends up in a big sort of complex organisation, there are lots of opportunities to move around. So for me, I spent a couple of years at the foundation, then was seconded into a leadership development role, because part of my background is also neuroscience and psychology. So I spent a good part of a year in that, then got seconded into another role in strategy and communicating strategy. So I spent a couple of years in that. And throughout that whole time, you are getting exposed to people at the upper levels of a big healthcare organisation. And for an outsider looking in, you see just a remarkable group of people and what they're doing for the community. But you also put a very different lens over the way that it operates and the dynamics that are in particular in the healthcare system. And for me in particular, this is probably showing my complete nerdiness when it comes to language and thinking about the paradigms that people operate in within healthcare. We still operate under this pathogenic paradigm, which is this notion that, that's not a blanket piece, but a lot of the time it's about people come in, we want to make sure they get fixed. And we have this notion that if you fix them, they get back to this notional sort of level playing field of health and well-being. Whereas I think human beings are far more complex and dynamic than that. And that's possibly the way which was effective to think about healthcare as the healthcare systems of the world were emerging. But these days it is far more than just primary, secondary, tertiary healthcare, which are playing a role in people's lives. We have a far better understanding of mental health, physical health, spiritual well-being, which even the World Health Organization has touched on, for many decades now. So I think we have a better understanding that there are all these different parts that encompass what may be the health and well-being of a human being. And then what is actually health and well-being for one person is not necessarily the same for another person. So trying to understand a lot more of those factors rather than having that, how would I put it, possibly that patriarchal view that the healthcare system and the people within it know best for what care is provided for an individual when they are participating, in a sense, in the healthcare system.
I'm so interested in thinking about this issue, having just worked for a little while in youth mental health and drug and alcohol. And I have a lot of questions, but also I wonder whether some of this patriarchal or, rigid system, however you want to describe it, how much perhaps that has affected the people's resistance to COVID, instruction, or maybe vaccination hesitation, because sometimes of the systems not really putting people first. And you worked at the hospital during COVID as well. That must have been really intense. So what do you think is the biggest, if we think about a wicked problem, what's the biggest wicked, there's many, but how can we change these systems from this idea of, I see many times, the health system unwilling to admit that, a treatment has a side effect, and what that side, then the quality of life that the person has, and just this constant notion of progress. And what you said before, that health and wellness is different to every person. Maybe they don't want that form of health and wellness, or
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to link a few things here together, but start off even just with a conversation today. So I was chatting with one of my uncles, and he's in his mid-70s, and he had a brain hemorrhage a few years back. And he's traveling okay these days, but at the time he was told by his doctors to give up his job. He was a panel beater and spray painter, but he also loved his golf as well. And they said to him, you'd have to give up golf. And after a little while, he said to the doctors, well, if I give up golf, that means I'm going to be sitting on the couch a lot more at home. What's going to happen if I'm sitting on the couch a lot more? And they said, well, you lose your physique and your muscular strength, and you'll end up wasting away. And he said, right, I'm going to take the risk of playing golf because I'm going to end up being sore after golf. I'm sore most days as it is. So I'm going to take the enjoyment of being out there, socializing with friends, getting some fresh air, getting stimulation, for most of us, getting, one or two decent holes through every round and enjoying that experience, because the cost of doing that isn't as great as, you know, what I miss out on if I'm just sitting on the couch at home. So in a sense, I said to him then, that's almost an example of someone within the healthcare system having absolutely the best intentions of saying, based on your injuries and your physical ailments at the moment, that you should probably give that up, versus a guy in his early 70s saying, you know, I don't have that much time left as it is in the grand scheme of things. I love playing this sport and I love seeing my mates. I love being out and about. I'm prepared to wear, you know, whatever the potential, you know, physical cost of that is to continue enjoying that. And then you get into the second and third order effects of that, that if he's not playing golf, there are other health complications down the track, as you mentioned. So I guess I use that as a mentality of that we need to interlink, in a sense, the wonderful subject matter expertise that we do have from our clinical staff, and they are going through years and years of training. They are seeing hundreds, thousands of patients. They are building up this wonderful bank of personal internal knowledge, and they have this wonderful bank of research that they can go on, but still understanding that every human being has their own desires, their own goals, their own interests, their own sense of what health and well-being actually means. And I think we are progressing, and mental health's a really interesting area, because that's possibly the first one to really take the salutogenic paradigm seriously, where it is coming back to what is the individual's sense of health and well-being, as opposed to necessarily thinking about how you fix someone. And there are other areas of healthcare too, which I think are far more broader perhaps than they once were. I'm not sure, to, I guess, go into the second part of the question, though, I'm not sure if we can necessarily unpick the Gordian knot that is the healthcare system in Australia. It's interesting, actually, if you go back to some of the white papers written, you know, 5-6 years back, there is this notion that we don't actually have a healthcare system in Australia, that it is really so disconnected that to call it a system is almost somewhat of a folly. That, you know, yes, we do have various healthcare services which are local, state, federal, and private, but the system itself is not actually a proper system. Which really adds another layer of complexity to the discussion, full stop. My feeling, and I've had a chat with a few people who have different viewpoints on this, is that we possibly can't change that notional system as it is. You can only nudge the system in that way. And I'll probably dive into, if anyone's interested, some of Donella Meadows' work from back in the 70s, 80s and 90s is still really revered in terms of the system change thinking. And Donella Meadows very much so was of the mentality that you need to change broadly the mindset of the public before you can really change the system, and not just the public, but also in healthcare, the administrators, the policy makers, your politicians, the way people think about the healthcare system. And that's a monumental job that will take a couple of generations. But for me, that's one of the starting points, is really thinking about how do we shift the mindset of what our healthcare system is there for. It's interesting for students who are in Queensland at the moment, there's an ongoing conversation about, you know, the unfortunate ramping which is happening at hospitals, where you have ambulances getting delayed and backed up, and patients not necessarily being seen within specific guidelines. But there are also, as within any system, there are also perverse incentives within certain systems too. So within pretty much every healthcare system I've read about, there are certain targets in relation to the speed with which you need to see patients coming into emergency and that sort of thing, which in itself seems fine until you have people then trying to game that system to ensure that they're meeting specified targets and they're not getting penalised by, you know, any superiors or funding bodies for not meeting those targets. So in some ways, the political discourse can be very, very simplistic, that the healthcare system can be, again, you know, fixed by adding beds to the system or by adding ambulances to the system. And if it was that easy, I think the healthcare systems of the world would have been fixed a long time ago. So I don't sit here professing that I have the answers of how to do that, but the more we can get health consumers, the more we can get GPs, nurses, specialists, policymakers, you know, complexity thinkers even in the room, to have these conversations and do it from a really curious kind of standpoint where people accept that nobody's got the answer to these super complex problems, but understanding how do we potentially start creating different models, perhaps outside the existing models, where we can actually go and experiment and test what some more contemporary approaches to healthcare might be. To me, that's the starting point, because that's when we'll find whether those new approaches, obviously backed up by research, actually have a high level of efficacy in allowing people to live their best life possible.
Yeah, there's so much there that you're talking about. It's hard for me to pinpoint on one particular thing, but one thing that I really think is important is this notion of health care. And care is not really something you can rationalize the way that the system tries to rationalize care. And by having metrics and having all these timings and all these different things. There was this great article I read, and it was about kind of post maternity care, where the nurses would go to see, the midwives would go and see the women who had just had babies, and there's a depression score specifically for postnatal depression. And some of the women, they felt like the nurses wanted to take something from them. There was a sense of suspicion, like they wanted to catch them out with this test rather than feeling cared for because of this rationalization of the system. And I also think there's a really gendered dimension to it as well, particularly, a lot of the health workforce is women. And women, there's a traditional kind of idea that, you could be a nurse or you could be a teacher. These are the jobs that are, for women because women are caring. But that essentializing notion that women are caring doesn't speak to the fact that actually that's not, just because you're a woman doesn't mean you care more than a man. And so you become a nurse, it doesn't mean you're going to have this inherent like care or carefulness in your work, because their strength could be something, totally different. But yet, because of the gender norms, they've ended up in these jobs that and maybe not the best fit. So that's, I think, a challenge as well. How they keep calling, are we going to have more nurses? We're going to, bring more nurses in or more ambulances. And yeah, I often think that there are a lot of resources there, but the way they're being used, and it's challenging.
It's challenging. I mean, you bring up some great points, and geez, you could have a few long podcasts about these questions and the discussions. When we get into, in a sense, gender normalizing roles as well, I think 90% odd of the nursing workforce are female. I can't give you an exact number, but that's a reality. So that says to me, well, what are we doing within the broader society to have people feeling as though that is a role which is far more suited to women? Is it because males are avoiding those roles? Is it because women are attracted to those roles? How do, in a sense, transgender people view those roles as well? And then we get into the depths of that mentality of, yes, perhaps if we looked at it broadly speaking, perhaps women are more nurturing and caring than males. But again, we're looking at very broad categorization there rather than the specifics of a midwife who is under enormous stress to see a number of people on their ward each day. And then when they're delivering a numerical based test, which in a sense is useful to a certain extent, but it's also, it's not perfect by any means, then what is that doing for that mother who's just come through, potentially a 25-hour labor, going through this emotional roller coaster ride of bringing another human into the world, who knows their background of what their family life is, whether they have any mental health challenges that they've worked through previously. It's tough. And, I put my hands down. I know a number of midwives and they are phenomenal people who are under an enormous amount of stress at the most. It's a blessing and a curse that they're there in arguably the most special time in many people's lives. but there's also an enormous amount of pressure and responsibility that goes with bringing a human life into the world. So I get your point in relation to the surveys, and that's a very, as you said, a very rational piece of what happens often in the healthcare environment. And scorecards, again, are useful to a certain extent, but they, in no shape or form, do they tell the whole story of the human. They tell this very isolated piece at a point in time as to how somebody's feeling. And, you know, in some ways, do we need to go down that pathway to a certain extent to try to ensure that we are notionally ticking that box, that we're investigating the health and well-being of that person, but in no shape or form should that be the entire view of that complex human, and understanding their health and well-being throughout that entire journey where they're both inside and outside of a hospital environment too.
I mean, I often wonder whether the arts and humanities could have more influence in technical spheres, like, you know, I mean, you're in rail now, but in health. And I know there's probably an idea that it's frivolous, you know, that, as you know, imagine that as well as a tick box numerical test, that they also drew a picture, or something like that, just to add different dimensions to the experience, and to maybe express something that couldn't. Or whether they had like a poet in residence at the hospital, you know, that would, you know, just to add, you know, something else to the experience. I know they trial certain things. They have animals, you know, in children's wards or hospitals, you know, some things, but that it was more part of it, that it wasn't separate worlds, that these worlds were together, you know.
Yeah, they're all interconnected. I think, you know, I couldn't agree more with that. It's interesting you mentioned the notion of, you know, drawing a picture. So anecdote from my time in strategy, working with an executive team, and the very first time we were retrospectively looking at an organizational strategy, the first thing I asked them to do very kindly was to draw a picture of what they thought the strategy meant. And it was a great exercise because 3 or 4 of them really got into it and really tried to, you know, project what they were visualizing and project that in a different form. A handful couldn't help themselves. They still went back to the dot points that they were comfortable with, because they're comfortable with in a sense, the concrete nature of semantics and words, that, you know, that's the area that they live in. Some did sort of other bits and pieces, but it was interesting just how it allowed that more rich discussion to occur, because people are so used to reading text and interpreting that text. You know, and if we're going back thousands and thousands of years, let's face it, our ancestors across the world weren't communicating using words. They were communicating using pictures and I dare say sounds and movement, and dance, far more than they were, you know, before we progressed to using language and words. And then I think it was the 1400s, perhaps, when the printing press was invented over in China. So the evolution of words and that becoming the dominant part of our environment is a relatively recent thing in the evolution of human beings. And even if we go into that notion, that written document, which is so much a feature of healthcare, being the key piece, you know, that's something which really only came in when, you know, in a sense, academia started really coming to the fore in the late, you know, 1800s, early 1900s. So it's really something that has not been a big part of our history. So I think we can embrace some of those more abstract and nebulous and artistic and creative ways of transferring meaning and sense making amongst each other, including in the healthcare system, which, you know, for anyone who's been through it knows that it's dominated by diagnostics and numbers and, you know, really analytical thinking, if we're being honest, and that's again useful in certain circumstances, but in wildly complex environments that can be a big challenge.
Yeah, even, you know, as you're talking, thinking about what might be the place of collective rituals in a health service, for example, and how that could, you know, be of help to break things up a bit, or, just to add some vitality or something, something different. I'm going to, yeah.
No, I'm curious what you think there about in terms of rituals or different
Mhm.
ways of coming together, what they might be for the
Yeah,
healthcare system.
what
Have you
could
got any
they
thoughts
be?
on
I
it?
mean, they could be like collective sing-alongs. They could be, maybe they could be, different kind of sharing things where, for example, doctors, might share about, the story, the cases that most affected them to really humanize. So it's like more of a having various types of rituals maybe that could just add a different cultural dimension, also that acknowledges the different spaces, that it's not all in that clinical setting, that people's lives are outside in different settings, and maybe being able to take health into other places would be good. I know they try to do in the community, but yeah, in a hospital setting, maybe having different kinds of spacing, having a skate park out the front, having just
Love it.
something different, right? Or a roller skating rink. That would be fun. Bringing
Yeah, it's
different
very,
kinds of
very cool.
spaces together. Yeah.
It's interesting what you talk about there too, there's probably two things I'll touch on there in terms of taking health to different spaces. And the HIT model, the hospital and the home model, is getting a lot more traction now. And thankfully there are some pieces of research which are actually coming out probably the past 2 or 3 years, which are showing a strong level of efficacy of hospital in the home treatment. And I think it's fair to say most hospitals have really dipped their toe in the water with that model of care. The other part, which I'm really interested to see, I think it was over in Scotland. They trialed maybe 6-7 years back a program called, it was either What Matters to Me or What Matters to You, but it's a very simple idea. But each patient was encouraged to, I think, write on their, the whiteboard above their bed what was really important to them. And it might have been, say, that their garden was getting looked after at home or their animal was getting fed. And then the healthcare workforce would have some volunteers who would go out and help the people who were stuck in hospital with that. And they found it really sort of lowered their stress levels while they were in that period within a hospital bed when they were an inpatient, because all of these things that really mattered to them in that world outside of that hospital bed, that was almost completely out of their control during their hospital stay. So it gave people a level of surety that when they went back to their homes, that their place was looking okay, or their friends or family or their pets had been well looked after. So again, a very simple approach, but acknowledging, as you said too, that people have lives, before, during, after their hospital stay. So we need to acknowledge that that's an interconnected part of them getting better while they're in hospital and being treated for whatever it may be.
And also would be great to have more sharing of expertise. So for the, patients to be properly explained their charts and what the different numbers mean. Nobody's ever explained to me about blood pressure, for example. Like, I just know that mine is a little bit low, but I don't know what the numbers mean. I don't know. I couldn't tell you the number because it doesn't mean anything to me. And sometimes I wonder whether some things that are guarded as this kind of expert knowledge is not really, it's something that could be explained if the person wanted to know more about their
Yeah.
health.
Yeah, and spot on.
Yeah.
Some patients don't necessarily want to know, but I think there are a large portion out there who want to understand more about the care and the treatment that they're receiving. I'll touch back, I think it was about 2016, the Cleveland Clinic over in the US, Adrienne Wassey, who was I think she was their chief customer officer at the time. She took on some research on a program that they were running. But the program was a full day session for every single clinician in the hospital relating to communication and empathy. So trying to help clinicians with the basics of understanding what does it mean to actually see the world through a patient's eyes. And again, they got some really strong findings from that not only was it better for the patients, that the patients felt more comfortable and less stress and understood more about their care. But for the clinicians as well, it took a level of stress off them, because they then felt as though the patient was likely to be more compliant, say when they left the hospital, and continuing medication or continuing visitation to other healthcare providers, because the person had given them the sense that they understood what was being articulated to them. So therefore they felt more confident that the patient would be compliant, which turned out was one of the big stresses that clinicians had, that when a patient leaves their care, it's out of their control what happens to them from there.
So, I mean, it sounds like, trying to create a partnership with the other person, rather than, it's all on the clinician to fix them, that it's working together where possible.
Yeah, spot on. It goes from, in a sense, I don't want this to sound awful, it goes from that parent-child relationship of, I know best, so I'll tell you what's best for you, to a relationship of equals, where both people, as you have said, are partners in care. And I've no doubt, and I've seen it in practice, there are some clinicians who are amazing at every level of healthcare in doing that. But I'd be lying if I said that overarching paradigm of, that the system knows best is still what a lot of people experience too.
So, I mean, yeah, there are some, amazing people, and it's kind of like, it's just like they've found the perfect, role for them, where, they've got the right strengths for the job. And then we try to maybe replicate it, or, train people into these things, but it doesn't quite work. And yeah, I've just been thinking, is it about supporting people earlier on to try and find, what would fit and what is needed? A lot of people become doctors because it's considered prestigious, or they become nurses because that's a gendered job, and they think that rather than, does my skills and capabilities, will they fit? And then will I be satisfied there? Because there are a lot of people, you meet teachers who just love their job, they're so passionate, and you meet nurses who are just amazing, and doctors, there are some fantastic doctors, and then you meet others who they're frustrated, or they're not satisfied. And yeah, I just wonder how we could think more about supporting people in thinking about employability and their own, futures. What's a good way? How did you do it? How did you find, do you think you just got lucky, or did you have mentors, or, how did you figure it out?
I don't think I've figured it out. I'd probably take it more that it is for want of a better word, it's a journey as well. And I guess when it comes back to, I'll start with healthcare. It's an interesting question. If you're a patient, do you want the specialist who is highly skilled, who has no issues with 99.9% of their surgeries, or do you want the clinician who's an incredible communicator, warm, empathetic, keeps the family informed, but has a high percentage of issues with the work that they do? Some people would choose the former, some people would choose the latter. So I think in a way there is a place for everybody in every single sector that they work in. But much to your point, what I would like to see is people just taking a broader range of opportunities as they evolve through an organization. So if you're a doctor, I'm painting a broad brush here, but you kind of get narrower and narrower as you go further into your career, and then some of them will get to a point, say in their 30s or 40s, where they've been earmarked to move up the leadership pipeline and eventually get into administration, and then that might be the first time they've ever had to encounter not just complex problems, but complex problems involving something beyond data. So, people and dynamics issues, strategy alignment or misalignment as well, dealing with funding bodies, dealing with governments and policymakers, all these things that are so far out of the sphere of what a clinician might learn about or be mentored about as they're coming through, because in some ways, rightly, we're trying to make sure that they're the best clinician that they can possibly be within their chosen field. So I'd like to I guess in a way, I like to think that we could possibly do a better job at creating people who've got a broad range of thinking skills and mental models and disciplines which they understand, and then hopefully that gives them the opportunity to weave their way into, I guess, the areas that perhaps fit them best. If I apply that to my life, I would not in any shape or form say I intentionally carved out the path that I did. A lot of it has been about, say from a study perspective, I dived into neuroscience and psychology because again, that was just an area I was fascinated by, and it was helping me in the workplace at the time as well. And that ended up being part of my career in learning and development. From a strategy perspective, I kind of know personally my brain tends to think at more of a macro level and love the complexity of different things coming together, and not everyone wants to do that. You know, a lot of people like working backwards and like analytical thinking and reasoning and looking for a root cause to every issue. You know, that's their part that they like. I like thinking in far more sort of nuanced and you know, nebulous terms, and some people don't like ambiguity, whereas I love ambiguity. So in a way, I've probably just gravitated towards those roles which have really suited me, and that people have seen that I would be in a sense suited in those roles as well.
Yeah. So for this course, students will be working in small groups and they have to identify a wicked problem or an area or a sector they want to work on. And I think, you know, you've given us some great thoughts in the health area. But while we have you, it would be really good to hear just a bit about transport and rail and what are the wicked problems that you're coming across or seeing or coming to understand there that students might be interested in thinking about with their groups.
Yeah, it's funny how, I mean, if you think about rail, it's it seems like such a linear thing. You know, you put a train on a track and the train runs down that track. It eventually gets to the end of a line, driver walks down the other end and then drives the train back along that linear line. So in a way, that's the simplicity of rail summed up in one sentence. But rail, whether it be in Queensland or other areas of the world, is a pretty complex environment because you are constantly trying to understand and adapt to the needs of customers. You know, if you want to put it in simple terms, we can fit 600 people on a 6-carriage train. And that operationally, that might be the best way to go. It means you have to run the least number of trains throughout the day to move the most possible number of people within a certain time span. So if you're thinking about it from a constraint perspective, if you add the layer of that's actually a really, really crappy customer experience though, if you're packed in like a sardine with 599 other people on a train, and that's pre-COVID obviously as well. You know, so there are those different layers where you're trying to balance the operational needs, the constraints of the volume of the rolling stock that you've got timetabling, you have different influences at a political level who will want to ensure their constituents are getting looked after. But from a complex perspective and possibly more a futures thinking perspective as well, what I'll be really interested in is seeing how rail becomes part of the broader thinking of mobility as a service. So if we think about, in a sense, the Ubers of the world, and how ride sharing and the integration of artificial intelligence and driverless cars, how that might affect how, you know, the likes of you and me think about how we're getting to work, how we're getting to university, how we're getting to our kids to sport or dance or whatever they're doing at the weekend. That can fundamentally change the way we think about how we move around a city and its environs. So with rail, that's a really kind of linear piece within that, because you can't, you know, not cheaply, you can't just create these branches where rail diverts into different areas. So how does rail integrate as part of a really mass transportation piece within a city, or a conurbation, which in southeast Queensland would be Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast and Toowoomba? What's the role that rail can play interacting with those other providers who are part of the broader notion of mobility as a service? I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the way we think about rail travel and necessarily timetabling, but from a consumer perspective, I think it really has to change the way we communicate what rail is about, the frequency of rail, and how it links up with those other modes of transportation, which are very different from, you know, what we've had traditionally within the rail environment.
Yeah. I grew up in Melbourne and
Mhm.
in the, you know, inner city suburbs. And so, you know, catching the train all the time, and it was great, and trams and everything felt very connected. And I live on the Gold Coast now, and public transport seems really unaffordable for an adult. If you There's not a lot of incentive to catch public transport. So I don't know. It's I know it's expensive, but I feel like it's such a great way to get around by public transport, and it would be so good to have more. And I know, I mean, the Gold Coast is interesting case where there was so much protest against the light rail coming in, and
Mhm.
people didn't want it. And so, you know, some little areas said, we don't want to stop there because we don't want it, and we don't want to station there. And now it's used all the time. People love it,
Mm.
and the stops are in strange places. Like there's a primary school, and they didn't want a station in front of it, and now children have to walk like quite a long way, maybe a kilometer, to get from the station to their school. So
Mm.
it's it's interesting. You know, people love cars, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if sorry, we'll go back to one of my favorite words here too, paradigm. If you lived in Melbourne, I was lucky enough to live in London for 4 years. Your way of thinking is that public transport is your first, second, and third option when it comes
Mm,
to moving around the city,
mm,
because it's cheaper, it's easier, it's faster. So all in all, it's more effective. So in a sense, the value proposition is greater. When you think about Southeast Queensland in general, some areas have great public transport service, other areas are not so great. And the Gold Coast is a funny example because the Gold Coast was really exploded as a population 50s, 60s, 70s. So it wasn't designed around public transport, even though there was a South Coast rail line running down there in the first half of the 20th century. And if you go back to, say, in the UK, most of the towns, as in a sense the rail lines spread out from London and beyond, many towns were built around those rail lines and where those rail lines were stopping. So in a sense, rail had such a significant impact on where towns and cities were set up in the UK, because it was really the primary mode of transportation back in the 1800s. So that really determined where people were effectively residing and making a living. And I think in Brisbane and the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast even, I'm not sure how we go about it from here. There's talk of, in a sense, making a sort of 45 to 60-minute cities where anyone within that broader conurbation can, you know, travel to the Brisbane CBD within an hour. And to do that, at the moment, our mindset is that has to be through, say, high-speed rail connections. And perhaps that is the best solution. But I think that's also guided by the fact that that's what's been done previously. So who knows what the best solution may be in 15, 20 years' time. It may be different modes of transportation that we haven't even thought up yet. So I guess the big challenge in Southeast Queensland, and I hope that's where a number of the students are, is really shifting the mindsets around what is public transport and how do we use public transport. And here's another, you know, sorry for diving in a bit much. Here's an interesting one in terms of cost, is that who should be wearing the cost of public transport? So should it be the consumers who are using public transport, which in a sense is disincentivizing people to use public transport, when public transport is a more environmentally friendly form of transportation and people moving around cities? If you then make public transport notionally, say, free of charge for users, what is going to be the knock-on effect of that in terms of the cost of public transportation versus some of the I guess the savings that we have in efficiency and productivity, and the environmental improvements that we have, they are all incredibly complex aspects which come into the conversation. But so often we get stuck in the mode of, okay, well, if someone's using a train, someone's using a bus, they should be the ones who have to pay for it.
I mean, it would be, maybe they have done kind of feasibility studies like that about what the savings would be if you didn't have to think twice about getting on a train or a tram or a bus and getting to where you need to go, and how that might just alleviate a whole lot of, just, by enabling mobility for so many people who, there are many people on low incomes who have to think about every trip they take. And so yeah, that would be fascinating, even about mental health. Like, what would it mean if you could get wherever you needed to go without having to think about how much it would cost, and whether you can afford it. So
yeah, spot on. At the end of the day, we've kind of commoditized every single thing in society, including the right and ability to move about a city and its environment. So it's kind of, to get to that point, I think we'd have to really shift our mindset in the way we look at what are the rights of people within a city, a nation state, and so forth. We could dive into universal basic income and those sorts of thoughts as well, in terms of alleviating stress on people, and their ability and feeling to move about. So they really are deep conversations which go well beyond the realm of transport, but public transport is something which is, front and center of our lives every day too.
yeah, no, definitely. I think we could talk about a lot of things, but we're getting close to an hour now, so we should wrap up. But I wanted to finish with a question. I mean, just, thinking about students today, and you have children that probably younger, I don't know. I have two younger sons, and but thinking about these students, they're in their final year of their bachelor's. Some might be going on to further study or into the workforce, but what might be some advice that you would give them in moving forward and thinking about how they can take, everything they've learned into the next stage of their lives?
Right. I'm going to think of a second one as I try to wheel around the first one. So the first one would always be to read and listen to perspectives which challenge your own way of thinking. And I find this really challenging at times, but I'll intentionally put on a podcast from someone who's of a completely different political ideology, or in a sense, a very simplistic thinker in a way. And it will really frustrate me while I'm listening to it, but it also gives you that sense of that person's coming from a very legitimate perspective of why they have a belief or a value or a way of thinking about a situation. So it just kind of forces you to really appreciate that everyone has different perspectives, and that you need to be able to, you're not going to influence anyone in the workplace unless you understand what's in it for them, how they think about the world. You're banging your head up against a brick wall. So that's probably the first one. And that comes back to curiosity as well. If you're curious, you'll always be prepared to challenge your own perspectives and ways of thinking. The second one is probably more about lifelong learning, to be honest, is that we don't have a clue what the workplace, the world's going to look like in, I'll use my time frame. I'm 40 now, so I finished my undergrad, say 20 years ago. The world has changed a lot, but also hasn't changed much in that 20-year period. So 2 decades from now, we don't know what planet Earth is going to look like. For all we know, healthcare could be a great industry to get into, because you've got millions of people who are suffering from heat stroke from climate change every year. Pretty negative thing, but healthcare is going to be dealing with those impacts for a long time to come. So it's just to continue challenging yourself to learn and read and think and discuss, and never feel as though you know everything. One of the best pieces of advice I got after my journalism course finished was that you'll learn more on the job in 3 weeks than you have in, say, the 3 years that a BA journalism major took back in the day, that was spot on. It's probably even 2 weeks before I learned more. You know, your undergraduate study is a wonderful foundation, and, you know, particularly to get exposed to a course like this too is really building your level of critical thinking and ability to take on perspectives, but just continue trying to learn and discuss perspectives with people each and every day.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks so much for your time. We will, you know, if you've got any, you know, key readings or articles or podcasts that you'd like to share with the students, just send them through to me, and I'll make them available so that they can start to engage if they're interested in some of those issues. So
great, and thank you so much for having me, Adele. It's been a pleasure. I hope I haven't waffled on too
oh
much
no, I just wish
for
we had
everybody.
longer, but
Yeah. But honestly, best wishes to everyone doing the course. I so wish I'd had access to a course like this 20 years ago, and hopefully it puts you on, even if you don't move into strategy or complex thinking. I think it will give you a wonderful foundation, and, you know, once you start seeing problems as wicked problems rather than just simple problems, you don't look back. It's just a different world.
that's awesome. Thank you.